The mist over the Blackwood River that morning was thick enough to swallow a manhole, just the way I like it, cool and quiet, hanging low over the dark water like a soft, heavy blanket that kept the rest of the world at bay. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the dark roast I grind myself every morning because at 71, those little rituals are the only things that keep the gears turning straight, and I felt the warmth spread through my chest as I stood out on the cedar dock. This place, this patch of trees and water we call the Shallows, was supposed to be my sanctuary, the home I built plank by plank with my late wife, Martha, back when our backs were strong and our dreams were even stronger. It wasn't an Oppos, just a house. It was 30 years of anniversaries, scraped knees, and quiet sunsets soaked in every grain of wood. But that morning, the silence was broken by something that felt like a slap in the face. I was halfway through my second cup when I saw it. A bright, neon orange flyer tacked right to the boathouse door, and it looked like a jagged wound against the weathered gray wood. I walked down the dock, my slippers damp with dew, and my stomach did a slow, heavy roll when I saw it was an Oppos. Just taped there, but nailed a single rusty head driven straight into the door Martha and I had painted together a decade ago. I pulled the nail out with my fingers, feeling a surge of protective heat in my chest, and read the heading. Summit Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, final notice of delinquency. Now, the first thing you have to understand is that I'm not a member of any Summit Ridge HOA. My property line stops a full quarter-mile before their gated, manicured little kingdom even begins, and my deed, signed by my father in 1954, says I own this land clear and free. The notice claimed I owed $17,000 for $112 in quote, unpaid maintenance assessments, in quote, and in quote, architectural noncompliance fines, in quote, including a specific demand for the removal of my, in quote, unauthorized, in quote, dock, and at the bottom, in bold, ugly letters, it said I had 48 hours to pay or, in quote, remedial demolition, in quote, would commence. I didn't in Oppos to get angry at first. I just felt a profound sense of confusion, thinking some poor clerk in a basement office had typed the wrong parcel number into a computer. So I went inside and dialed the number on the letterhead. A woman answered on the first ring, her voice dripping with that professional, sugary sweetness that usually means someone is about to try and rob you with a smile. End quote. Summit Ridge, this is Brenda. How can I help you today? End quote. And I explained as politely as I could that there had been a massive mistake, that my cabin was on the river, not in their development. There was a long silence, then a soft, condescending little chuckle that made the hair on my neck stand up. End quote. Oh, Mr. Garrison, we were wondering when you'd call, end quote. She said, her voice dropping into this practiced, pitying tone, end quote. I'm afraid there's no mistake. Your property was annexed into the association during the special session last autumn. And while I understand change is hard, the board has been very patient with your lack of cooperation, end quote. I told her flat out that you can Oppos just, end quote, annex, end quote, a man's private property without his signature, and she just sighed, that long, theatrical sigh of a person dealing with a stubborn child. End quote. Mr. Garrison, the law is a very flexible thing. When the community decides on a direction, I suggest you find the funds, or will be forced to take the value out of the structures themselves. Have a blessed day. End quote. The line went dead, and for a second, I just stood there in my kitchen, looking at the photos of my kids on the fridge and feeling like the world had tilted off its axis. I thought about calling a lawyer, but I knew how these things went, years of litigation while my bank account bled dry. So instead, I called my oldest, Elias. Now, Elias doesn't Oppos talk much. He's a man of few words and even fewer smiles, mostly because he spends his days as a field office director for the DEA, dealing with people who make HOA presidents look like choir boys. I told him what happened, and there was this long, heavy pause on the other end, the kind of silence that usually precedes a thunderstorm. End quote. Dad, end quote, he said, and his voice had shifted. It was cold, clinical, the voice he uses when he's briefing a tactical team, end quote. Don and Oppos. Say another word to them. Don and Oppos. Sign anything, and for God and Oppos. S sake, Don and Oppos. Let them on the property. I'm calling Sarah and Toby. We're coming up tonight. End quote. Sarah is my middle child, a senior special agent with the FBI and OPPOS. As white-collar crime division, and Toby, my youngest, is a criminal investigator for the IRS. So when I say my family is in the business of enforcement, I'm not exaggerating. They rolled in my driveway around dinner time in 3 separate black SUVs, looking like a government motorcade, and they didn't end OPPOS. To even stop for hugs before they started unpacking laptops and files onto my old oak table. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. My children, who I used to tuck into bed, were now treating my living room like a mobile command center, and within 2 hours, Sarah had pulled the digital records for the Summit Ridge HOA. She leaned back, rubbing her eyes, and looked at me with a grim sort of pride. End quote. Dad, this ISN and OPPOS. A clerical error. It's a shakedown, end quote. She said, pointing to a name on the screen. Victoria Vance, the HOA president. It turned out Victoria was a disgraced real estate developer who had moved into our county and started, end quote, restructuring, end quote, HOAs. And she had a habit of finding older, high-value waterfront properties and burying them in fake fines until the owners folded and sold the land to her, end quote, investment group, end quote, for pennies on the dollar. The next morning, the sun hadn't end OPPOS. T even cleared the tree line when I heard the low, guttural rumble of a diesel engine and the screech of air brakes at the end of my gravel drive. I looked out the window and my heart stopped. There was a flatbed truck with a yellow excavator on the back, and standing next to it was Victoria Vance herself, looking like she was dressed for a safari in high-end heels and a white blazer. I walked out onto the porch, my kids standing right behind the screen door, and Victoria didn't end OPPOS to even wait for me to speak. End quote. Mr. Garrison, you've ignored our generous outreach. End quote. She shouted over the idling truck, her face a mask of full regret. End quote. The board has voted to declare this dock a public nuisance and a safety hazard. We're here to clear the site. End quote. I told her she was trespassing on private land, and that if that machine moved an inch, I'd call the sheriff, and she just laughed a sharp, ugly sound that echoed off the water. End quote. Call him, end quote. She sneered, end quote. I've already submitted the annex plat to his office. As far as the county is concerned, this is HOA common ground, and you're just a squatter in an unapproved dwelling, end quote. She signaled the driver, and the excavator started to crawl off the trailer, the metal tracks clanking against the pavement like a death knell. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Elias, and he stepped out onto the porch, followed by Sarah and Toby. They weren't into OPPOS. T wearing their badges. Not yet. They were just standing there with this terrifying, quiet confidence. Elias didn't in OPPOS. TL, he just walked down the steps and stood directly in the path of the excavator, crossing his arms. The driver slowed down, looking confused, and Victoria marched over, her face turning a deep, angry purple. End quote. Move this old man out of the way. End quote. She screamed at the driver, then turned to Elias and quote, Who do you think you are? You're interfering with a legal demolition. End quote. Elias just looked at her, his eyes like 2 pieces of flint, and said, quote, Mind OPPOS. I'm the man who's giving you 10 seconds to turn that engine off before I turn this into a federal matter. End quote. Victoria scoffed. She actually rolled her eyes, and quote, Federal? This is a local zoning issue. You idiot, you have no standing here, end quote. But then Toby stepped forward, holding a thick stack of papers he'd printed that morning. End quote. Actually, Ms. Vance, end quote, Toby said, his voice light and almost cheerful, end quote. While you were busy in OPPOS, annexing in OPPOS, my father in OPPOS, S-Land, I was busy looking into the 501c4 status of your association, and it's funny, I couldn't in OPPOS. T find any record of the $400,000 you collected for the new community pool, but I did find a very interesting offshore account in the Cayman Islands registered to A and OPPOS, Vance Global Holdings and OPPOS. End quote. The color drained out of her face so fast I thought she might faint. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but she didn't in OPPOS. T stop. She was a bully, and bullies only know how to move forward. End quote. That's private business. That has nothing to do with this doc. End quote. She shrieked. Sarah stepped down then, holding her phone up, showing a live video feed of the county clerk and OPPOS' office. End quote. Victoria, I just finished a very long chat with the district attorney, end quote. She said, her tone as sharp as a razor, end quote. It turns out that the Indapos, special session Apos, you held to annex this land, never actually happened. The signatures on the petition were all forged, including several people who have been dead for 5 years. And since he used the U.S. mail to send those fraudulent notices to my father, that makes it mail fraud, which is a felony, end quote. Victoria looked at the excavator driver, who was already starting to back the machine back onto the truck, and then back at my kids, and for the first time, she looked small. She tried to pivot, tried to pull that sugary sweetness back out her pocket, end quote. Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm sure there's been a massive misunderstanding between our offices. We can settle this like neighbors, end quote. Elias took a step closer to her, and even though he's my son, he looked like a stranger in that moment, a force of nature. End quote. We aren't in Apos. T neighbors, Victoria, end quote. He said, end quote. And we aren't in Apos. T settling. We're enforcing. End quote. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his credentials, flipping the gold shield open in the sunlight. Sarah and Toby did the same, and the silence that followed was so heavy you could feel it in your bones. The driver of the truck didn't end Apos. T wait for another word. He hopped in the cab and roared out of my driveway, leaving Victoria standing there in the dust, clutching her clipboard like a shield that had already been shattered. But it didn't end Apos. T in there. See, Victoria had friends in the local government, people who had been looking the other way for years, and they tried to bury the investigation. They thought they could wait us out. A week later, I woke up to find that someone had come onto the property in the middle of the night and spray-painted, end quote, HOA property, end quote, in giant red letters across the side of my cabin, and they'd cut the lines to my boat. They were trying to break me, trying to show me that even with my kids behind me, they were the ones who controlled the ground I walked on. I sat on my porch that morning, looking at the red paint, and I felt a tear run down my face, not because I was scared, but because I was tired. I was just an old man who wanted to fish and remember his wife. My kids saw that paint, and that was the moment the gloves truly came off. They didn't end Apos. T just go after Victoria anymore. They went after the whole rot. Sarah spent 18 hours a day tracing every penny that had ever entered the Summit Ridge accounts, while Toby coordinated with the state police to interview every homeowner in the development. They found out Victoria wasn't into Apos. T just stealing money. She was using the HOA to launder cash for a construction racketeering scheme, and the end quote, annexation, end quote, of my land was supposed to be the site of a new, private marina she'd already sold shares in. The final showdown didn't end Apos. T happened on my dock. It happened at the Summit Ridge annual board meeting. Victoria was standing on a stage in the community center, looking regal and untouchable, telling the residents that, end quote, unfortunate legal delays, end quote, were holding up their amenities when the back door swung open. I walked in first, wearing my old work jacket, and behind me came Elias, Sarah, Toby, and a dozen state troopers. The room went dead silent. I walked right up to the stage, climbed the steps, and stood at the podium. Victoria tried to block me, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. End quote. You can Apos. TB here, Garrison. This is a private meeting. End quote. I just leaned into the microphone and said, end quote, I'm not here as a member. Victoria, I'm here as a witness. End quote. Sarah stepped up and handed a stack of warrants to the bailiff, and Elias walked over to the microphone. End quote. Victoria Vance, you're under arrest for racketeering, embezzlement, mail fraud, and 24 counts of felony forgery, end quote, he said, his voice echoing through the hall. The residents started murmuring, then shouting, as the reality of what had been happening to their money and their community started to sink in. Victoria didn't end Apos. Go quietly. She screamed. She spat. She told everyone they were nothing without her. But as the handcuffs clicked shut, she just looked like a pathetic, broken woman who had finally run out of lies. The aftermath was a whirlwind. The Summit Ridge HOA was placed into receivership. Victoria ended up taking a plea deal that landed her 7 years in a federal penitentiary, and the end quote, annexation, end quote, was declared null and void by a circuit court judge who apologized to me personally. My kid stayed for another week, helping me scrub that red paint off the cabin and rebuilding the boat lines. On their last night, we sat out on the dock, the one the HOA wanted to tear down, and watched the fireflies dance over the water. It was quiet again, the good kind of quiet. I looked at my children, these three powerful, dedicated people I'd raised, and I realized that while I'd spent my life building things out of wooden wire, they'd spent theirs building a world where people like Victoria advanced on into oppos to get the last word. I still live in my cabin, and the Summit Ridge folks mostly leave me alone now, except for the occasional neighbor who wanders over to share a beer and tell me how much better things are now that the queen is gone. It makes you think, though, about how many people out there are being bullied by these little kingdoms, these people who think a title and a clipboard give them the right to take a man's piece. I got lucky because my family happens to be the ones who carry the badges, but most people don and oppos have that. It's a strange world when you have to go to war just to keep what's already yours. But I suppose as long as there's land worth having, there will be someone trying to steal it with a pen and a smile. So, I've got to ask you, have you ever dealt with a situation where someone in power, whether it's an HOA, a local boss, or just a bully with a title, tried to rewrite the rules just to get what you worked for? Does justice actually exist for the people who don and oppos? Do you have a family of federal agents standing behind them? Or is the system just designed to protect the ones who know how to manipulate the paperwork? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, because honestly, I'm still trying to figure out if I won because the law worked, or if I won because I had the bigger guns. Don and oppos, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about the times the little guy actually got to swing back. And I'll see you all in the next one.